What's up? This is a piece from Robert J. Alexander's International Trotskyism book. The entry is titled French Trotskyism, the 1952 PCI Minority and its Heirs, Lutte Ouvrière and Other French Trotskyist Groups. The faction which had constituted the minority of the Parti Communiste Internationalist, the PCI, before the split in 1952 continued to function under the PCI name for more than a decade and a half after the division of the party. It remained affiliated with the International Secretariat, headed by Michel Pablo, and then in 1963 joined with the majority of the International Secretariat in reuniting with the Socialist Workers' Party and some other affiliates of the International Committee to establish the United Secretariat of the Fourth International. PCI leader Pierre Franck was one of the principal figures in both the International Secretariat and the United Secretariat. The Franck Parti Communiste Internationaliste, published from August 1952 on a periodical of its own, La Vérité des Travailleurs, which at first was a monthly and then a bi-monthly. 10 years later, in 1962, the name of the publication was changed to L'Internationale, quote, to end the confusion with La Vérité, end quote. Then, at its 18th Congress in October 1965, the Franck PCI once more decided to change the name of its periodical to Quatrième Internationale. Although, as we have already noted, the PCI had very little success in infiltrating its members into the Communist Party and lost most of those who were able to enter the PCF. They did so somewhat better with another experiment in, quote, entrism, end quote, which they started in the 1950s. Left-wing elements of the Socialist Party broke away to form first the Autonomous Socialist Party, PSA, and then the United Socialist Party, PSU, and at least some of the Pierre Franck Trotskyists entered that group. One of them, Rudolf Prager, was elected to the Central Committee of the PSU, the United Socialist Party. Although it was well known that he was a Trotskyist, he remained active in the PSU until the 1969 presidential election campaign, when he was expelled for publicly supporting the Trotskyist nominee, Élan Krivine, instead of the PSU candidate, Michel Rocard. The Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire. During the 1950s, the Pierre Franck PCI remained a tiny organization. It was not until the early 1960s that the party began to make some headway, gaining some influence in the communist youth, particularly in the communist student organization of the University of Paris. The Paris newspaper, Le Monde, later described how Élan Krivine, a leader of the Union des Étudiants Communistes, UEC, and a number of his associates were won over to Trotskyism, quote, in 1962, as the secretary of the history section of the UEC, the Union des Étudiants Communistes, he founded the Front Universitaire Antifasciste, which confronted the OAS group, bracket, the right-wing extremist, and bracket, in the Latin Quarter and elsewhere. In 1963, a meeting in Paris with the Belgian Trotskyist leader Ernest Mandel brought him definitively under Trotskyist influence. But it was not until 2 years later that Krivine was expelled from the Communist Party, after having, quote, submerged, end quote, himself along with his comrades in the left wing of the UEC for 2 years and conducting a fight at the 1965 UEC Congress for the, quote, right of tendencies, end quote, and, quote, real de-Stalinization of the French Communist Party, end quote. He was expelled from the party in January 1966, end quote. Krivine and his followers then organized the Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire, JCR. During the following 2 years, they centered their activities on protests against the Vietnam War. It was in the student uprising of May-June 1968 that Alain Krivine and the JCR achieved wide national and even international attention. In an interview after the uprising, Krivine described the role of the JCR in those events. Quote, "From the start, the JCR fully integrated itself in the movement, even though we were aware that the forms the student movement was taking were extremely provisional. We realized that these forms, that is, the anti-leadership, spontaneity worshipping, sometimes anarchist aspect of the movement, could not last without threatening to get the student struggle bogged down. But we thought that the movement would develop as a result of the students' experience and by our posing political problems and the need for political organization," end quote. The Paris newspaper Le Monde subsequently indicated the key role the JCR had played in the student movement of May-June 1968. It said that, quote, "the JCR, which had the most numerous cadres, played a role of mobilization and inspiration, which the specialists judged decisive. It was it, notably, which furnished the UNEF the marshals for the principal demonstrations, ... end quote. Krivine indicated that what the JCR had gained from its role in the 1968 student uprising. Krivine said that, quote, "In Paris, for example, the JCR doubled its membership during the May-June mobilization, and it was the same in many provincial cities. But aside from this very intensive recruitment, what was much more important for us was the hearing we were able to get before thousands, tens of thousands of youths. This means that when classes resume, we will be the strongest left political organization in the high schools and universities, ... end quote. Not only the Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire, but also the Parti Communiste Internationalist was active in the May-June 1968 events. Pierre Franck commented that, quote, "This is indicated by the daily bulletins and leaflets. I don't think we made any mistakes on the political line in day-to-day tactical problems. Our activity, of course, was limited by our forces. The Renault was turning day and night. But that doesn't carry very far when you have a movement of 10 million people on strike in the factories, ... We were accused, along with other, quote, groupuscules, end quote, of being responsible for the movement. We'd be very proud if that was so, because if we had been in charge, it would have finished in another way," end quote. The PCI strongly condemned the Communist Party's attempts to dampen the rebellion. A bulletin of the PCI condemned the negotiations of the communist-controlled CGT to end the workers' general strike. It claimed that, quote, "the workers will reject," end quote, "the CGT's efforts. Quote, "They will strengthen the unity of action between the workers and students, ... forward against the Gaullist regime, for a workers' government," end quote. After the end of the May-June 1968 revolt, the de Gaulle government outlawed both the JCR and the PCI. On this occasion, Pierre Franck commented that, quote, "We are studying the legal aspects of the measure and are reserving our right to challenge it. We are confident that many labor and civil liberties organizations will speak up against the dissolution measures taken by the government against a series of vanguard organizations, and will struggle against these decrees until they are abrogated. In any case, the Trotskyists, who have undergone many repressions before, will emerge from this attack stronger than ever," end quote. The Ligue Communiste. In April 1969, the PCI JCR Trotskyists, who had in the meantime been publishing a newspaper, Rouge, established a new organization, the Ligue Communiste. There were 300 delegates at the founding Congress of the LC, and, quote, the Congress divided into a majority of 80% and a minority of 20%. The minority was divided into two tendencies. One could be characterized as, quote, Maoist spontaneous, end quote, and the other as centrist, end quote. The minority was given representation on the Central Committee of the LC, which was described as, quote, a highly centralized organization capable of assuming the historical task when the foreseeable class struggles next break out in the continuing crisis of the French and international bourgeoisie, end quote. It was decided to affiliate with the International Secretariat of the Fourth International. Shortly afterward, on May 6, the Ligue Communiste named Alain Krivine as its candidate for president of the Republic in elections provoked by the resignation of President de Gaulle. Krivine was at the time serving in the 150th Infantry Regiment at Verdun, in which he had been drafted soon after the May-June 1968 events. Krivine was given a special furlough to conduct his campaign. Krivine received 239,076 votes, or about 1% of the total, compared to the leading candidate in the first round election and ultimate victor, Georges Pompidou's vote of 10,050,804, or a little more than 44%. In the second round, the Ligue Communiste campaigned in favor of a blank ballot. In the period following its establishment, the Ligue Communiste centered much of its attention on campaigning against the war in Vietnam. In November 1969, this brought the temporary arrest of Pierre Franck, Alain Krivine's wife, Michel, and various other leaders of the LC. In spite of the role which many of its leaders had played in the May-June 1968 movement, the Ligue Communiste was not able to maintain a continuing major influence among the students. Many years later, a leader of the group who had gone through the experience attributed this to the fact that the LC people continued to appeal to the students principally on such grand issues as the Vietnam War, rather than becoming involved with more mundane issues having to do with the living and study conditions in the universities. In contrast, the OCI Trotskyists did pay extensive attention to such matters and were able to emerge as the political group with most influence in the student movement. The Ligue Communiste also conducted campaigns on several other international issues in addition to Vietnam. These included protests against the persecution of Czech dissidents, demonstrations against the Franco regime's persecution of Basque nationalists, and rallies to back the Palestinians. In June 1971, they organized a large demonstration together with Lutte Ouvrière, the Lutte Ouvrière group, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Paris Commune. The Second Congress of the Ligue Communiste met late in May 1971 in Rouen. It was reportedly attended by nearly 500 delegates and observers, including 45 observers from organizations in 27 different countries. It was reported that, quote, according to the credentials report given to the convention, 65% of those present were under 25. By occupation, they were 25% wage and salary workers, 43% teachers, and 43% students. 10% were female, end quote. The Ligue Communiste suffered some persecution at the hands of the government of the President Georges Pompidou. Late in 1971, Charles Michelu, executive editor of Rouge, was accused of 5 counts of libel against the police and was found guilty on 4 of these charges. He was fined the equivalent of about $1,300. A month later, the well-known publisher François Maspero, who had recently joined the Ligue Communiste, was convicted on the same kind of charge. On October 21, 1971, 13 members of the political bureau of the Ligue Communiste, including Henri Weber, Daniel Ben Said, and Charles Michelu, were arrested in connection with the demonstration the Ligue Communiste had organized in front of the United States consulate some time before. They were subsequently released without any formal charges being brought against them. Early the following year, another Ligue Communiste leader, Pierre Rousset, was jailed for some time, allegedly for being involved in transmitting, quote, material capable of being used in making explosives, end quote, to Latin American revolutionary groups. In spite of the LC's support for Latin American terrorists and guerrilla activities, the party expressed opposition to the kidnapping of Robert Negret, head of personnel of the Renault company, supposedly by Maoist elements. The Ligue Communiste issued its own statement on the subject and joined with several other groups in another criticism of the kidnapping. It also issued a statement denouncing the international outcry against the murder of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Olympic Games. Charming. During 1972, the Ligue Communiste won two groups of recruits from the Parti Socialiste Unifié. In January, a group of 17 PSU members publicly announced that they were resigning from the party and joining the LC. Then in December, 47 more PSU members, including 2 who belonged to its National Bureau and 3 from its National Political Directorate, announced their affiliation with the Ligue Communiste. The Third Congress of the League met in December 1972. There were 287 delegates who were said to represent, quote, 386 cells, 80 cities, and 18 sections of Paris. Of the delegates, 176 were workers, 100 students, and 11 high school students, end quote. The League claimed a membership of 5,000, including 68%, quote, full members, end quote, and 32%, quote, candidates, end quote. It was said that, quote, the League has cells or members in 270 factories and carries out regular propaganda activities in 100 others, end quote, and that it, quote, has more than 50 full-time functionaries throughout the country, end quote. The last mass activity of the Ligue Communiste was its participation in the parliamentary elections of March 7, 1973. At the League's December 1972 convention, a minority had favored abstaining on both rounds of the election. However, a majority of 191 to 23 supported nomination of Trotskyist candidates in the first round and supported the candidates of the Socialist Communist Left Radical Union of the Left on the second round. As a consequence, in the first round on March 4th, the League ran a joint slate with another Trotskyist group, Lutte Ouvrière, the two parties appointing candidates between them and not running rival nominees. The Ligue Communiste ran 92 candidates who received about 100,000 votes. The general results were that the vote of the joint Trotskyist slate, quote, generally ranged between 1.5 and 2%. In a few cases, the far left vote was 3%, and in one case it was even 5%, end quote. Subsequently, the Ligue Communiste followed through on its plans to support the candidates of the Union of the Left in the second round. Pierre Franck explained how they were able to do so in spite of the presence on the ticket of left radical nominees and the historical opposition of Trotskyists to popular fronts. He argued that the left radicals, quote, represent neither a political nor a social force. They are individuals who were elected with the help of communist and socialist votes, The Union de la Gauche, therefore, is an alliance of reformist parties solely and not an alliance between the reformists and any bourgeois party. From this standpoint, the Union de la Gauche is not a new popular front, end quote. In June 1973, the government of Pompidou suddenly legally dissolved the Ligue Communiste as an aftermath of a demonstration by the League on June 21st, held to protest a meeting in the Mutualité building in Paris of a far-right organization, Ordre Nouveau, which I suppose is New Order, during which there had been clashes with the police. Alain Krivine and Pierre Rousset were arrested. This action of the Pompidou government aroused very extensive protests from a variety of organizations, including the socialist and communist parties and several trade union groups. The Trotskyists organized a worldwide campaign of protest. The League's newspaper, Rouge, continued to publish, and for a time the former members of the Ligue Communiste rallied around it. They did not try to maintain any formal party organization. Krivine was cited as saying that, quote, "We do not want to reconstitute the League secretly. We will continue to express ourselves legally. But we think it would be melodramatic to get into a situation where several thousand militants would have to go underground," end quote. The election in mid-1974, precipitated by the death of President Pompidou, provided members and leaders of the former Ligue Communiste with a chance to establish a new organization. This was the Front Communiste Révolutionnaire, which was organized to back the presidential candidacy of Alain Krivine. As at the same time, it was noted that, quote, "The FCR's program emphasizes the need for independent organization of the working class. The socialist alternative to the bourgeois parties and the reformists is projected in such demands as expropriation of all the big industrial trusts and the banks, with management to be placed under workers' control, ... end quote." After the election, Daniel Ben Said, member of the political bureau of the ex-Ligue Communiste, noted that the FCR, quote, "is ready to play, in an even better fashion, a role that has been poorly filled since the dissolution of the Ligue Communiste. The task is immense, but we will not be deterred. The election was only the beginning, not the end," end quote. By the end of the year, the FCR had been converted into the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire. The new group held its first Congress in December 1974. The first decade of the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire. The membership of the LCR remained very young. A report on its founding Congress stated that although the average age of the delegates there was 3 years higher than that of the delegates to the Third Congress of the Ligue Communiste 2 years before, quote, "the most numerous age brackets in the organization are 21 to 26 years old, 47%, 26 to 30 years, 27%, and 18 to 20 years, 13%, end quote. This document went on to say that, quote, "about 50% of the militants have been in the Trotskyist movement only since 1972. Only 26 have more than 5 years political activity and are current. 21% joined in 1974, end quote. There had been a certain degree of, quote, "proletarianization," end quote, of the LCR compared to the LC. At the time of its founding Congress, 61% of the members were reported to have been, quote, "wage workers," end quote, but only 12% were, quote, "blue-collar workers," end quote. Whereas 17% were white-collar workers, 15% technicians, 3% supervisory personnel, 13% tenured teachers, 8% substitute teachers, 4% were unemployed. University students still made up 24% of the LCR's membership, and 5% were high school students. There were at least 4 factions or, quote, "tendencies," end quote, in the LCR at its inception. The majority element, which had about 60% of the delegates at the founding Congress of the LCR, oriented the group toward trying to achieve unity with what was left of the Parti Socialiste Unifié. The PSU had recently split, with a majority of its leaders and members joining the reconstituted Socialist Party headed by François Mitterrand, and those remaining in the PSU had called for, quote, "building a revolutionary and self-management force," ... end quote. The Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire majority felt that these events presaged the expansion of French Trotskyism by absorbing what was left of the PSU. One of the first activities undertaken by the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire was the organization in October 1975 of a, quote, "fête rouge," end quote, to raise funds to convert Rouge from a weekly to a daily paper. It was reported that, quote, the LCR projected the festival as a meeting place of groups to the left of the communist and socialist parties in France and internationally. Groups of this type, as well as sections of the Fourth International, were involved to set up display booths and to promote their literature, end quote. The Paris newspaper Le Monde, in reporting on this Fête Rouge, commented that, quote, the importance of this demonstration goes considerably beyond its strictly utilitarian interest. It was also a matter of showing that the Trotskyist movement, and tomorrow its daily newspaper, undertakes and will be undertaking actions and struggles solidly rooted in day-to-day life. ... It was a particular success for the LCR, end quote. In spite of their initial optimism, the leaders and members of the LCR recognized by the end of 1976 that they were in fact making little progress. The sympathetic Paris weekly magazine Politique Hebdo prefaced an interview with LCR leader Renault Yvetot, YVETOT, in November 1976 with observations on, quote, the temporary crisis racking the far left, end quote. Is Politique Hebdo, Charlie Hebdo? I'm gonna look this up. Sorry. I don't know, I'm not saying anything on that. It would require more research than I'm willing to do right now. It noted that, quote, this crisis is a moral one. For many, political activism has become unbearable. It is a crisis of organization. Copying the Bolshevik model, even restored to its pre-Stalinist, quote, purity, end quote, has led to dysfunctions, ... This has resulted in under-politicization of the activist and in the intermediary cadres becoming mired in bureaucratism. It has increased the gap between the top and the bases. The crisis... What the fuck? The crisis is also a political one. The contrast between the political marginalization of the far left and its real base in the unions... inspires a retreat into sectarian siege mentality or else opportunism... The League is going through its, quote, moment of self-criticism, end quote, end quote. This situation was recognized by the Second Congress of the LCR in January 1977. The, quote, organizational thesis, end quote, adopted there noted that, quote, although having acquired a determining weight in the extreme left, the LCR is not an organization with significant working class roots. In developing its audience, it is in a political and organizational crisis, end quote. The Second Congress, attended by 420 delegates, was marked by very extensive debate among the various points of view represented. A report on the meeting noted that, quote, the vote on the political resolutions... indicated the emergence of a new majority. Tendency E dissolved and adopted the amended resolution put forward by Tendency D. The latter received 54.7% of the votes, as compared to 27% for Tendency A, 4.7% for Tendency B, 3% 4.2% for the Brest Working Group and 4.45% for the other working groups, end quote. The most bitterly debated question was the role of women within the LCR and the work of the organization in the women's movement. For several years, much of the energy and resources of the LCR centered on publication of a daily newspaper. The first issue of Rouge as a daily appeared on March 15, 1976. From its inception, it faced problems of limited circulation and high cost. It was reported in June 1977, when daily sales were 11,000 copies, that 5,000 more were necessary for Rouge to break even financially. The LCR had a special drive to raise 800,000 francs to allow the paper to, quote, survive the summer, end quote, of 1977. Finally, in February 1979, the political bureau of the LCR decided to reconvert Rouge from a daily to a weekly. The LCR also published a theoretical review, Critique Communiste. Usually each issue of this publication dealt broadly with one kind of problem. For instance, early issues dealt with ecology and environmental matters, militarism and Bonapartism and municipal issues. The October-November 1977 issue examined the 60th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution and discussion of the eternal question among the Trotskyists of the, quote, nature of the Soviet Union, end quote. In 1979, the LCR was able to establish a youth group, the Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire. That organization held its second Congress in December 1980, at which attention was particularly centered on the coming presidential election and upon gaining influence among young workers, since the organization was principally made up of students. With the approach of the parliamentary election of 1978, the LCR first sought to negotiate with the parties of the Union of the Left, socialist, communist, and left radicals, particularly with the Communist Party, presumably with a view to getting some LCR candidates included on the ticket of the coalition. Its rationale for this position was expressed by Rouge, quote, if the left wins, the two principal parties of the working class will be present in the government, and the workers will think that this government is theirs, ... end quote. However, the communists were quite unwilling to enter into negotiations with the Trotskyites, and Charles Fitterman of the Communist National Secretariat was quoted as saying that, quote, all dialogue with the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire is totally inopportune, end quote. When the communists in effect broke up the Union of the Left, at least temporarily, by demanding fundamental changes in the coalition's, quote, common program, end quote, the LCR sent a, quote, open letter to the Communist Party, end quote, in which it urged the PCF to agree in the second round of the elections to support socialist candidates where they had run ahead of the communist nominees in the first round. This letter noted that, quote, the issue is not whether 250, 500, or 729 subsidiaries will be nationalized. The burning issue for the workers is, will Giscard, Barre, and Chirac triumph once again, or will the workers' parties win a majority, end quote. When the PCF, in fact, decided to continue to run all its own candidates in the second-round elections, Krivine of the LCR denounced that decision as, quote, sectarian, end quote. The Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire itself formed a coalition with two other far-left groups, the Organisation Communiste des Travailleurs and the Comité Communiste pour l'Autogestion. Autogestion being self-management, with each organization agreeing not to run competing candidates in the first round and to support each other's nominees. This coalition issued a joint electoral platform, and the LCR issued its own platform, in which it argued that, quote, the kind of government that the workers must establish is not a union of the left government. It is a government of the Communist Party and Socialist Party alone, of which the workers will insist that it meet their demands and respond to their aspirations, end quote. Soon after the 1978 election, the LCR sponsored a meeting attended by 10,000 people on the theme, quote, May 1968 to May 1978, end quote, which centered particularly on the significance of, quote, Eurocommunism and the future of the French Communist Party. The speakers included not only leaders of the Trotskyist groups, the LCR, Lutte Ouvrière, but also Roger Garaudy and Jean Ellenstein, who had recently been expelled from the Communist Party, as well as the Soviet dissident Leonid Plutchich. Malo de Molina, international secretary of the Spanish Communist Party, and unofficial representatives of the French Socialist and PSU parties. Following the split in the United Secretariat of the Fourth International at the end of 1979, when the followers of the Argentine Nahuel Moreno broke away from the USEC, a split of some importance took place in the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire. A significant minority of the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, perhaps between 400 and 500 members, opposed the expulsion of the Morenoists. They broke away to form the Ligue Communiste Internationaliste, which in September 1980 merged with the OCI of Pierre Lambert. The LCR held its fourth Congress at the end of June 1980. It adopted a general political resolution, one of the 1981 presidential election, one on the, quote, construction of the LCR, end quote, and new statutes for the party. There were minorities of varying sizes in the vote on each of these documents. The one on the, quote, construction of the LCR, end quote, passed with only a 53% majority. The most important decisions of the Fourth Congress were those to run Krivine once again for president in the forthcoming election and to follow the general policy of the United Secretariat affiliates of a, quote, turn to industry, end quote. Although the LCR ran Krivine as its candidate in the first round of the 1981 presidential election, the party's fifth Congress in December 1981, after the election of Mitterrand, and subsequent parliamentary elections which gave the Socialist Party an absolute majority in Parliament and the Socialist-Communist combination a two-thirds majority, proclaimed that, quote, this government is not a bourgeois government like the others, since the Socialist Party and the Communist Party are overwhelmingly in the majority, and the workers who have permitted their victory turn to them to govern in their interests, ... end quote. It added that, quote, the conflict will become sharp between the austerity policy of the new government, ... and the hopes of the electoral majority of the workers' parties among the workers, made more urgent by the feeling of their own power, end quote. The Fifth Congress saw revolutionary potential in the situation. It claimed to see, quote, the prospect of a confrontation between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which leads in time to a revolutionary situation in France, although it is not possible to foresee its rhythm, profundity, or duration, end quote. This same political resolution of the Fifth Congress of the LCR claimed that the principal, quote, organizational task, end quote, of the party was, quote, to generalize the turn towards industry, end quote, so as to gain more influence in the organized labor movement. As a matter of fact, the LCR was particularly active in the communist-controlled Confédération Générale du Travail. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I've been pronouncing that way for all these readings, so maybe I'm just butchering it. In the socialist-oriented Confédération Française Démocratique des Travailleurs, CFDT. Leaders of the CFDT admitted to the author in 1982 that there was an active LCR minority in their organization, and one said that the LCR supporters caused difficulties for the CFDT leadership because they always took, quote, extreme positions, end quote. There were no Trotskyists in the national leadership of the CFDT, although CFDT leaders admitted that the LCR had strengthened a number of the Confederation's local unions. It clearly continued to be more difficult for the LCR to work within the CGT, which generally was still tightly controlled by the Communist Party. LCR leaders claimed that they had helped to get a number of CGT local unions to express strong support for the Solidarity movement in Poland, even after it had been suppressed by the Polish government. In the first round of the 1981 presidential election of the Ligue communiste révolutionnaire, once again nominated Krivine as its candidate. At the time, it issued a pamphlet entitled Alain Krivine, Candidate of Labor Unity, which stressed the need to defeat President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Insisting that the LCR had long supported electoral unity between the socialists and communists, criticized the public quarrels between leaders of those two parties, concluding with the argument that the best way in the first round to show support for working class unity was to vote for Krivine. However, about 2 weeks before the first round election, electoral authorities removed Krivine from the ballot with the explanation that all the legal requirements for listing him as a candidate had not been fulfilled. After Mitterrand's election and his decision to dissolve parliament and call new legislative elections, the Central Committee of the LCR adopted a resolution calling for establishment of a purely socialist communist cabinet insisting that the socialists and communists must collaborate in the parliamentary poll. The pamphlet containing that resolution noted that the LCR would have candidates in the first round in, quote, several dozen constituencies, end quote. It also proclaimed that, quote, to vote for the candidates of the LCR is to vote against the right, making guarantees for the future that the hopes of May 10th not be betrayed, end quote. Early in 1983, the LCR issued a pamphlet denouncing the failure of the Mitterrand socialist communist government to fulfill these same hopes and stressing again the need for a new revolutionary party. Quote, for more than a year and a half, there has been a National Assembly and government with a socialist and communist majority. Unemployment remains the problem number one of the French. Isn't what was true in 1979 with more than 1 million unemployed even more true in 1982 with more than 2 million, end quote. The pamphlet insisted that a new revolutionary party was, quote, indispensable to reinforce the unity, independence, and mobilization of the working class, end quote. The LCR ran a joint ticket with Lutte Ouvrière in the 1983 municipal elections. They labeled their list, quote, the voice of workers against austerity, end quote. The LCR held its 6th Congress in January 1984. It adopted a political thesis which had the support of 60% of the delegates, but 3 other drafts had the backing of 25, 14, and 1% respectively. This resolution claimed that the experience of the left in the government was, quote, the failure of a policy of class collaboration, end quote. It sketched the role of the LCR in seeking, quote, the united mobilization of the workers, end quote, its insistence to the socialists and communists on the, quote, need to govern against the capitalists, end quote, and in organizing opposition groups in various unions. It returned strongly to the theme of the need to build a revolutionary workers' party, in passing indicating its willingness to talk about unity with the PCI and Lutte Ouvrière. At the time of the reorganization of the Mitterrand government in July 1984, with a change of prime ministers and removal of the communists from the cabinet, Rouge made clear the LCR's position toward the new version of the administration. One headline read, quote, combat this government, end quote, and proclaimed that, quote, the union of the left, rising on May 10, 1981, died on July 19, 1984, end quote. It also challenged the communists to become, quote, the champion of the class struggle, end quote. The Lutte Ouvrière Group. Early history of Lutte Ouvrière. The third major French Trotskyist tendency since the early 1960s has been the Lutte Ouvrière Group, LO. It traced its origin to a faction of the pre-World War II Parti Ouvrier Internationalist, which broke away in 1939 under the leadership of David Korner, more generally known as Barta, and his wife Louise. From the beginning, the Barta Group adopted a position which was to characterize it and its successors for more than 4 decades. According to Jacqueline Plouet-Despatin, the group argued that, quote, the ideas of the Russian opposition had not taken root in the French working class milieu because of control over the proletariat of the country by 2 opportunist parties, one of which, the Communist Party, gained its prestige from the Revolution of October. The ideas of the opposition were disseminated above all among the intellectuals, ... The communist opposition thus acquired a petty bourgeois character, which strongly handicapped the later development of the movement at a moment when the power of proletarian action in the years 1932 to 1938 should have permitted diffusion of its ideas. End quote. This emphasis on the primordial need to concentrate agitation among the workers became a hallmark of the Barta Group and its successors. The Barta Group published in November 1940 a statement on, quote, the struggle against the Second Imperialist World War, end quote. In it, they argued, according to Jacqueline Plouet-Despatin, that, quote, the occupation of France by the armies of the Reich did not give any validity to the national problem. If it was felt necessary to break down the bastions of imperialist violence, which are Germany and Italy, and refuse Hitler the right of speaking as master, this must be done through the class struggle, end quote. Plouet-Despatin added that, quote, the means of carrying this out, according to Barta, are passive resistance to German imperialism and active struggle against the anti-worker action of the French bourgeoisie, end quote. In October 1942, the Barta Group began to publish a monthly periodical, La Lutte des Classes, which thereafter appeared, quote, with remarkable regularity, end quote. In it, Barta continued to call for transformation of the imperialist war into a civil war, predicting major revolutions at the end of the conflict in Germany, Italy, and other European countries. He opposed participation in the resistance and was very critical of what he saw as the nationalist weakness of some of the other French Trotskyists, end quote. No, sorry, not end quote. No quote. Just markings on the PDF. Although there were some negotiations between the Lutte des Classes group and the other Trotskyist factions during World War II, these ended with Barta and his friends denouncing the, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, nature of the other French Trotskyist groups. As a consequence, the Lutte des Classes group did not participate in unification of French Trotskyism, which resulted in formation of the Parti Communiste Internationalist in March 1944. During the war and immediate post-war periods, the Barta Group was formerly known as the Union Communiste, Fourth International. After strong protests by the PCI, the Barta faction's use of the name of the International, they changed their name in May 1946 to Union Communiste Trotskyist. They were in that period more commonly known as the Lutte des Classes Group. In the immediate post-war period, the Lutte des Classes Group concentrated on trying to get a foothold in the labor movement. Although not numbering more than 30 people, they did succeed in gaining influence among the workers of the Renault auto plant near Paris. In April-May 1947, they organized and led a strike in the Renault plant, which gained widespread publicity and resulted in substantial gains, although not a complete triumph for the workers of the enterprise. After the Renault strike, the workers were unhappy with the attitude that the CGT had taken toward their walkout and decided to organize an independent union, the Syndicat Démocratique Renault. The members of the Barta Group concentrated their efforts on the attempt to firmly establish that union and perhaps to have it as the core for a revival of the CGT. The new union put out a periodical, Les Voix des Travailleurs, and for the time being, La Lutte des Classes ceased publication. However, the union's paper closed down in January 1949, and in the following month, La Lutte des Classes reappeared. The Lutte des Classes group had not had the manpower or resources needed to carry out the kind of effort it had undertaken with the Renault workers. As a consequence, they soon lost influence in the Renault plant and by 1950 had virtually ceased to exist as an organized group. La Lutte des Classes again ceased to appear in March of that year. Former members of the group continued to see one another from time to time, and the events of 1956 provided the impetus for them to re-establish an active political organization. They got together to organize meetings to denounce both the Soviet invasion of Hungary and the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt, and in the process attracted a few younger people to their ranks. Reconstituted, the Lutte des Classes group began once more to try to gain some influence among the workers. They started to issue regular factory bulletins every 2 weeks, which were distributed among workers of several plants in the Paris area. These mimeograph bulletins consisted of a political argument on one side and news about the particular plant and the workers' problems in it on the other side. The group also began to issue a mimeographed version of La Lutte des Classes. Finally, in 1967, they began to publish a printed weekly paper, Lutte Ouvrière, from which they came to be known as the Lutte Ouvrière Group. By November 1967, the Lutte Ouvrière Group felt that it had gained sufficiently to formally constitute itself into a party. It took the name again of Union Communiste, Fourth Internationale, and Lutte Ouvrière became the organ of the revived party. As was true of most far-left groups in France, the events of 1968 gave a major impetus to the development of Lutte Ouvrière. Soon after the outbreak of the student strike and demonstrations in the universities of Nanterre and Sorbonne, the Lutte Ouvrière group, which had gained some influence among the workers in the factories in Nantes, played a major role in organizing a sit-down strike in those plants. They later said that this was the beginning of what soon became a general strike of French workers with the ostensible support of all three existing central labor organizations of that time: the CGT, Force Ouvrière, and the Catholic CFDT. A few months after the May 1968 events, the group published a special number of their paper describing those events. It particularly denounced the role of the socialists and communists in curbing workers' militancy. As a consequence of these events, the Lutte Ouvrière group doubled its membership. Those events also brought down upon it, together with most other far-left political groups, a decree by the de Gaulle government illegalizing them. A few months later, however, they were able to reorganize under the name Lutte Ouvrière, which was the new title of their weekly periodical. As Lutte Ouvrière, they supported the candidacy of the LCR leader, Hélène Krivine, in the 1969 presidential election. Electoral activities of the Lutte Ouvrière. During the 1970s, the Lutte Ouvrière group devoted considerable time and attention to the electoral arena. This was certainly not because they felt that they had a chance of gaining power through the ballot, but because elections provided their candidates with free radio and television time, and the party as a whole with a chance to establish contacts with workers, peasants, and others which otherwise were not available to it. As has been already noted in the first major electoral effort, the parliamentary elections of 1973, Lutte Ouvrière had an electoral alliance with the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, LO, up against 171 candidates described by Arlette Laguiller as, quote, all workers, metal workers, white-collar employees, postmen, railroaders, specialized and professional workers, nurses, technicians, ... all representative of our movement, end quote. The votes of the Lutte Ouvrière candidates came to more than 200,000, or about 1/10 of the vote received by the nominees of the Communist Party in the same constituencies. In the following year, Lutte Ouvrière for the first time ran a candidate for president, Arlette Laguiller, who had been one of the leaders of the recent bank strike in Paris. In the first round of that campaign, the Union of the Left ran François Mitterrand against Jean Chabon Delmas and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. I hope I'm saying that right. The candidates of the Gaullists and other forces on the right. In the second round, Mitterrand ran against Giscard d'Estaing and lost. In her first television address of the campaign, Arlette Laguiller explained why she and her party felt it important to run in the first round of the poll. She said, quote, "I want to say and repeat that my candidacy doesn't have for its objective to be an obstacle to the election of Mitterrand. Far from that," end quote. Rather, she said, quote, "I run to permit the workers to vote against the right without giving a blank check to Mitterrand. To permit them to affirm that whatever the results which emerge from the election booths on the evening of May 19th, it will be their wish to change their life, their resolution, which will be the determining one for the future," end quote. Arlette Laguiller received over 600,000 votes in the first round of the 1974 election. This amounted to 2.33% of the total vote. In 1977, Lutte Ouvrière ran joint lists with the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire in the municipal elections. The LO made perhaps its most spectacular campaign in the parliamentary election of 1978. At that time, it refused an electoral arrangement with the LCR. Instead, it put up 470 candidates, one for each of the constituencies in metropolitan France except Corsica, in the first round. It was reported at the time that almost all the nominees were wage or salary workers and that 191 were women. In that election, the LO ran Laguiller in the department of Puy-de-Dôme in the Massif Central region, in which there was a small industrial town and a surrounding agricultural area, and where they thought she might stand a chance of winning. However, she only received about 8% of the vote instead of 20 to 25% they had hoped for. The 20 to 25% they had hoped for would be hers. They had hoped would be hers in the first round. Jesus Christ. Leaders of the PCI and LCR accused the Lutte Ouvrière of conducting, quote, populist, end quote, rather than Trotskyist election campaigns, of emphasizing that Laguiller was a working woman rather than stressing her party's program. They also pointed out that the LO tended to do much better than the more... One second. Son of a gun. They also pointed out that the LO tended to do much better than the other Trotskyist groups, principally in the more backward parts of the country. In analyzing the results of the 1984 elections for the European Parliament, the French Pabloist periodical noted that Lutte Ouvrière had received about 2.09% of the vote throughout France. It commented that the distribution of Lutte Ouvrière's vote, quote, reinforces the presumption that the LO vote is more often a populist vote, of the small against the large, the governed against the governors, ... end quote. Lutte Ouvrière leaders did not entirely deny the charges of their rivals. They said that they did try to appeal to the average worker, to argue that the bourgeoisie cheated them, that it was unfair that the people who do all the work receive so little in return, rather than calling in their election speeches for the socialist revolution, or explaining to the workers their particular position on the nature of the Soviet Union or China, in which they felt the workers were not really interested. Insofar as the relatively good vote of LO in the more backward parts of the country was concerned, the Lutte Ouvrière leaders explained this in terms of the fact that they sought to offer candidates in all parts of the country, and that particularly in the more backward regions, workers and peasants were frequently impressed by the fact that the LO nominees traveled widely throughout their constituencies, seeking contacts with the more humble citizens who usually never saw a candidate for deputy. Other activities of the Lutte Ouvrière. Lutte Ouvrière continued to concentrate much of its attention and activity on the workers. As they had started to do in the 1950s, they were in the early 1980s still printing and distributing a variety of mimeographed bulletins for different groups of workers. An example of such a publication was Lutte Ouvrière PTT Paris 18, distributed among postal workers and dated July 6, 1982. The front of this throwaway dealt rather scathingly with the Mitterrand government's recently announced plan to limit wage increases. On the reverse side were various short items of specific interest to the postal workers of the Paris region. Lutte Ouvrière continued to work within all three major trade union groups, but particularly in the CGT and the CFDT. Before 1968, they worked principally within the CGT, although their trade union militants were often thrown out of CGT unions by communist leaders of those organizations. When this happened, they went into the corresponding Force Ouvrière, or CFDT union. They had some leadership posts in the lower echelons of the three central labor groups. Probably their most famous trade unionist was Arlette Laguiller, who was an official of Force Ouvrière's Bank Workers Union. Much of Lutte Ouvrière's time and attention continued to center on the publication and distribution of their newspaper. From the mid-1970s, they also published a monthly magazine, Lutte des Classes. It was subtitled, quote, Trotskyist Monthly, end quote, and bore on its cover the slogan, quote, for the reconstruction of the Fourth International, end quote. It carried longer and more analytical articles than were possible in a weekly paper. For instance, on April 20th, 1982, it had a piece attacking the economic policies of the Mitterrand government, an extensive article on the guerrilla movements in Central America, and a study of the Italian Red Brigades. Lutte Ouvrière organized an annual festival. The newspaper Le Monde noted that at their 8th annual, quote, fête, end quote, in May 1978, quote, the visitors promenaded ... almost 250 stands, some showing jewels or culinary specialties, others presided over by French and foreign revolutionary movements, the feminist movement, and the pirate radios, end quote. In the 2 days of the festival, 20,000 people attended. The festival grounds were dotted with banners proclaiming such things as, quote, the emancipation of the workers is the task of the workers themselves, end quote, and, quote, only one solution, revolution, end quote. Arlette Laguiller made the principal address of the festival. Unlike other Trotskyist groups, Lutte Ouvrière did not maintain a public headquarters where meetings open to non-members were held and the party's literature was for sale. Their explanation for this was that security considerations made the maintenance of such a headquarters dangerous. The Lutte Ouvrière group maintained more or less friendly relations with the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, although having little or no contact with the OCI-PCI. In fact, in the early 1970s, the LO and LCR negotiated on the possibility of unification and reached a tentative agreement. These discussions ultimately broke down, although various kinds of cooperation continued. Thus, in 1978, they participated in a public discussion organized by the LCR on the issue of Eurocommunism. In July 1982, the two groups began publishing each month a common supplement to their respective weekly papers. As we have already noted, the LO sometimes also cooperated with the LCR in the electoral field. A 1984 pamphlet of the LCR characterized relations between the two groups as, quote, fraternal and loyal collaboration conducting common work, end quote. Ideological positions in foreign contexts of Lutte Ouvrière. Lutte Ouvrière held different ideological positions from the French Trotskyist parties. Although they continued to recognize the Soviet Union as being a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, they denied that other Communist Party-dominated regimes were in that category. Those they defined as still being capitalist. However, they stood ready to defend any communist-dominated regime which was attacked militarily by a, quote, imperialist, end quote, power. In part because of its different ideological position, Lutte Ouvrière never became associated with any of the major tendencies within international Trotskyism. They did participate in the 1966 London Conference of the International Committee of the Fourth International and submitted a document criticizing the International Committee's characterization of all Communist Party-controlled regimes as, quote, degenerated or, quote, deformed worker states, but they did not join the International Committee. Subsequently, Lutte Ouvrière organized a number of international conferences of its own attended by representatives of various kinds of organizations. For instance, the sixth meeting in November 1975 was attended by people from the British International Socialist, the Italian Lotta Comunista Group, Combat Ouvrière from the French Antilles, Spark from the United States, the Spanish Party of Marxist Unification, didn't know they were still around in 1975, and the African Union of Internationalist Communist Workers, as well as Lutte Ouvrière. It was featured principally by a debate between Lutte Ouvrière representatives and those from the International Socialists about the nature and progress of the Portuguese Revolution. Subsequently, Lutte Ouvrière became the center of a small international Trotskyist grouping of its own. The other members were Combat Ouvrière, Spark, and the African Union of Internationalist Communist Workers, the last of these an organization of African workers resident in France. Other French Trotskyist groups. In addition to the three major French Trotskyist groups, that is, Parti Communiste Internationaliste, Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, and Lutte Ouvrière, there also existed by the early 1980s several other organizations which were or had been Trotskyist. Some of these were composed of dissident elements of one or another of the three major parties. Two groups which had broken away from the OCI-PCI were the Ligue Ouvrière Révolutionnaire and the Tendance Quatrième Internationaliste. The former was the core of the, quote, Varga, end quote, group, which was expelled from the OCI in 1971 to 72, and was affiliated with what was called simply the Fourth International. It published a 2-page weekly newspaper, La Vérité, which carried the subtitle Organ of the Ligue Ouvrière Révolutionnaire, French section of the Fourth International. The Tendance Quatrième Internationaliste also had originated in the OCI-PCI. It consisted of a small group which had broken away at the time of the expulsion of the Argentine group Política Obrera from the Lambertist International grouping, the CORQI, in 1979. In the middle of the 1970s, a small group associated with the international Spartacist tendency, the Ligue Trotskyiste de France, was established, reportedly as the result of proselytizing by several members of the Spartacist League of the United States. In 1978, it conducted a strong campaign against the Union of the Left, which it labeled a popular front. Its slogan was, quote, "Comrades, don't vote for the candidates of the Popular Front," end quote. However, there is no indication that the Ligue Trotskyiste had any candidates of its own. At the time of the 1981 presidential election, the Ligue Trotskyiste expressed its willingness to, quote, give savagely critical support, end quote, to the communist leader, Georges Marchais, if he would run against François Mitterrand. Subsequently, they condemned the, quote, betrayal, end quote, of Marchais and the PCF for remaining in the Union of the Left. In fall of 1980, the Ligue Trotskyiste de France began publishing a periodical, Les Bolcheviks. The editor-in-chief was William Cazenave. It carried on the same kind of campaigns as did the Spartacists elsewhere: opposition to Polish solidarity, support of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, strong opposition to the Khomeini regime in Iran. Well, at least they got something right. For some years, the Posadist section of International Trotskyism had a tiny group in France, the Parti Communiste Révolutionnaire Trotskyist, which in August 1962 began publishing a newspaper, Lutte Communiste. Like publications of other groups of that tendency, Lutte Communiste consisted in large degree of writings and speeches of J. Posadis. The Parti Communiste Révolutionnaire Trotskyist was not dissolved by the de Gaulle government after the events of May-June 1968, as were most of the other Trotskyist groups. It was reported as late as 1978 to be still publishing. The followers of Nahuel Moreno also maintain a very small organization in France after Moreno broke with the United Secretariat in 1979. Known as the Socialist Workers' Group, it began publishing a periodical, Litte Ouvrière, in 1982. However, no information is available about whether the group continued to exist in the mid-1980s. By the mid-1980s, there were also at least some sympathizers in France of the international socialist tendency. They were reportedly represented at an international meeting of that tendency in Great Britain in September 1984. No further details are available about this group. Finally, when Michel Pablo broke with the United Secretariat of the Fourth International in the mid-1960s, a small group of his followers was established in France. This was the Alliance Marxiste Révolutionnaire, AMR. In 1969, they attempted a policy of entrism in the Parti Socialiste Unifié, but that experiment proved fruitless and they soon broke away again. They then merged with another group, the Comité Communiste pour l'Autogestion, CCA. However, in December 1981, the CCA people withdrew and reformed their old organization. As was true generally of the followers of Pablo, the AMR by the early 1980s no longer considered itself a Trotskyite organization. Conclusion. By the early 1980s, the French Trotskyist movement was one of the most substantial segments of international Trotskyism. The Parti Communiste Internationaliste was certainly one of the largest Trotskyist parties anywhere. The Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire and Lutte Ouvrière were considerably smaller, and some of the other groups were minute in size. The three major Trotskyite groups all had at least marginal influence in organized labor, and the PCI was the largest single political group among the university students. The three parties were regarded as of sufficient political significance for the metropolitan press, particularly Le Monde, to report more or less regularly on their activities. Most of the tendencies within international Trotskyism had their French affiliates by the early 1980s. The PCI was the key organization in one of these tendencies, CORQI. Similarly, Lutte Ouvrière was the center of a small alignment of like-minded parties and groups. The LCR, for its part, was one of the major elements of the United Secretariat of the Fourth International. In addition, the Vargaites, Spartacists, Morenoists, and followers of Michel Pablo all had small organizations in France. It seemed possible by 1985 that disillusionment in the government of François Mitterrand and the parties associated with it in the Union of the Left might well present the Trotskyists of France with new and enlarged opportunities. Thanks for listening.